morning, everybody. Thanks for tuning in to another Bates Botanical Boot Camp. And you're with Austin today, horticulturalist here at Bates Nursery. And today I am talking transplanting. And what a great topic this is, because our city of Nashville has become a transplant location. Lots of different people from all over the country that are moving to Nashville, and that is kind of the start of my topic. What is transplanting? And it's simply just like humans. Plants are no different. We are going to move from an undesirable location to a more fitting location for us and our needs. And what this typically means is that whenever you get to a new home, or a plant gets to its new home, it has an adjustment period, if you will. So it's got what a lot of people would call transplant shock. Some people, I guess, go through shock whenever they get to a new city or a new area of town. We want to try to avoid the shock as much as we can and just have an adjustment period. So we all have that whenever we move to a new home. Now, what is kind of some of the reasons why we transplant, why we humans transplant different areas? Because say maybe you live up north and it's too cold for you. You want to move down south where it's warmer. Maybe it's too hot down south. You want to move up north because it's a little bit cooler. Either way, the location that you're in is not what you want, so you want to be moved. Plants are the same way, and this is, for the most part, there's a few different reasons why we transplant plants, and the biggest one, I think, this is what I think the most of the time happens, is a lot of times we think we have more shade than what we actually do. So we'll put a more shade-loving plant into a location that was more sunny than you actually thought, and the plant needs to be moved, because if it doesn't, it's going to fry or simply die with a shade plant getting too much sun. On the flip side of that, there could be a plant that you think is a full sun location that ended up getting more shade than you thought. So say you put a real sun-loving plant like a crepe myrtle or something, or a rose, and you put that in an area that has too much shade, what you get is a plant that will live, don't get me wrong, but it doesn't live to its full potential. So you don't get those great blooms that you would get on a rose or a crepe myrtle if it has too much shade. So you simply need to move it into a sunnier location. Another thing that happens a lot is putting a plant into wet of a spot. You notice that it does not drain quite like you thought it did, and there's a number of plants that do not like wet feet. There's a number of plants that can handle wet feet, and we can, choosing your plant is going to be what we need to figure out first. And, if you do find out you have that wet location, we can find plants for you that are better suited for that site. Another on the flip side of that is a spot that is simply too dry. There's plants that really like a good amount of moisture. Hydrangea comes to mind as a plant that really likes a good amount of, not just like wet all the time, but a moist spot is okay for a hydrangea, or say grasses like I've got here beside me are good for a wet spot as well. So choosing those plants, what we want to achieve is to not have to transplant. Okay. That is what we want to do. We want to get the right plant, the first time, and we put it in the right spot and it latches in and we never have to move it again. This simply doesn't always happen. It can happen. I know this personal experience. I've been doing this for a long time, and I even messed up, and I planted more of a shade bed, and now I'm realizing that shade bed gets a good amount of sun. So I've got some plants that aren't necessarily dying, but they're stressing a little bit. So I'm thinking about transplanting some of those myself. So it can happen to the best of us. Another very common, this is maybe the most common actually, is going to be having to transplant plants because they have gotten overcrowded. Whenever you first decide to plant a landscape, I think a very common thing to mess up is to plant too many plants too close together. And then you see this overcrowding. You start to get to where plants are all on top of each other. You lessen your airflow, so you start to see more pests and pathogens starting to get in there. A lot of fungal issues can happen whenever we overcrowd plants. So simply having to remove, say, every other one to create more space in between the plants, I think is another very common reason why we need to transplant. So there you go. That's kind of the reason why we do this. And like I said, we don't want to necessarily have to do this, but sometimes that is in order. So let's just start by talking about, transplanting doesn't just mean moving, something from the ground to another area of the yard. I'm certainly going to get to that later in this. But the first things first is transplanting from a container to either the ground or another container. So this is how we all get our plants and how we all bring them home and how we get ready to put them into the ground. So transplanting from this container into another container or the ground is another form of transplanting. So this is not hard to do. Containerized plants certainly make it easier on you instead of having to deal with, big chunky root balls or whatever that are on like a balled and burlap scenario. Containerized plants are a little bit easier. Now, what happens with containerized plants, especially, this is why I brought grasses in here today. I wanted to show you all this. Grasses and a number of other plants, the longer they stay in a pot, what happens? We all talk about this. We've all heard this term. It's called being root bound. Okay, being root bound is not that big of a deal. It's not like a killer of the plants or anything, like because the plant's root bound. The problem with the plant being root bound the most, especially if it is in a container, is having to water that plant. A lot of times the root boundness of it will spiral around the pot. It will make the dirt kind of squeeze in, and it makes like the edges of the pot have an opening to them. It's not like filled all the way to the can. So whenever you water, it tends to want to go to the sides of that plant and run right down. So that's the biggest problem with being root bound, is getting the water to it when you need it. Now, the best way to get rid of a root bound plant is to simply root prune. Now, we as humans are a little bit scared of roots. I don't know why. It's not that big of a deal. Roots are very vigorous, actually, for the most part. Some things aren't, but for the most part, roots can be just as vigorous as the tops. I mean, we prune the tops of shrubs and trees, and we prune to how we want and to get what we want to achieve. So why not prune the bottom of the plant as well? Those roots really, really like to be, messed up or severed even. And what happens when you do this is you cut the roots, and then it sends this response to the plant that says, okay, I need more. So whenever you do that, you put it down in there. After you sever the roots, it will say that I need to produce more roots. And then those roots will root down into the container that you're using or the ground, and they will seek their own water and make new, fresh, clean roots. So that's what we want to do. And I brought in a little example today. This is a little dwarf fountain grass. It's in a little quart container from Monrovia. And they are well known for having a very chunky root system. So if I were going to transplant this from this container, we're going to take it out of its pot. And look at this. It's an extreme amount of roots that are spiraling, circling. They're all matted onto each other. Even the bottom, look, totally root bound. This is certainly a root bound plant. Okay, you're going to have trouble watering that if you don't do anything about this. So the easiest, simplest way to do this with a little plant like this is to simply use your other hand and take it off, okay? I do this with every annual I ever plant. Any perennial, any shrub, any tree, it does not matter. We need to disturb the root system a little bit, and this is how we're going to do it. You're simply just going to grab it by the top. You're just going to take a bunch of that and literally just peel it off, okay? Get all the way around. I'm going to get dirty in here. Sorry, Tyler. It's your studio. I'm getting dirty. That's okay.
It always happens. I can't stop it.
So most of it's off. We're going to clear. Just go ahead. Look, bottom of those roots totally severed. And that sends that response to this plant to say, okay, I need to make more. Good practice to do with almost anything. And then on the sides of the roots, we're just going to kind of tease them. Just kind of open them up. You can sever some if you want. And this is still an extreme amount of roots, which is perfect for this little plant that's on top. All these roots are not necessarily needed, and it's going to make a whole set of new ones. So doing this first step, I swear, y'all, really quickens the process of re-rooting. If you just were to leave that on there and leave it alone and never touch anything, and you just sit it down in the ground, those roots are not going to really push very quickly. Whenever you do this, you get a much quicker response of root development. So I promise, I know this seems like it's a little harsh or like I took a lot, but there is still plenty of roots right here to handle this plant, and it's going to grow more quicker. So let's go ahead and do that. Do that with anything you ever buy, okay? That looks like that. Now, if you pull a plant out and it doesn't have this amount of roots and it's a minimally rooted, not root bound at all, then just simply, cut some of the biggest main roots or whatever just at the tips, just to send that response to them, and then plant them in there. So, don't sever 90% of the roots or anything, but doing this is certainly good practice. I promise I've done it with everything I've ever planted in my life. So there you go. Another way to get rid of roots whenever you want to transplant something is using I think one of the best gardening tools that there is. And I've recently did a video on how to separate plants. You can check that out. And what I used is like I said, one of my favorites, and that is a good old Sawzall. They make quick, clean, efficient cuts on plants that you can't use your hands to get them off. Some plants, I mean, they can be rooted so deeply and so tight on each other that you can't physically do it with your hands. So you have to use a tool to do it. So I'm going to show you about that in just a second. I brought a grass in here. This is a switchgrass. And really good plant for like erosion control along stream banks because they have an extensive root system. They really do. And that's why I brought this in here today, because I know this plant right here is going to have tons of roots down below that I'm going to need to get rid of before I plant it. And like I said, they're going to be so extensive that I'm going to use a Sawzall to do it. So let's kick this out of the pot and see what we got. All right. Not actually as bad as I thought. Dripping wet. We irrigated this morning. Plus, it's been rainy. We've had some nice little rain spells. But it is going all the way down and all the way on the bottom, making this just mass of roots that I just really don't want. I want to just get rid of. But I can't even barely budge that. I mean, it really, really hard for me to even do anything with that. So that's why I'm going to bring this tool. So let's lay it down. And y'all be careful doing this. Obviously, this is a power tool. So let me try to stand up and see if you can see this. Is this the way to do it, you think, Tyler? Can y'all see?
It's gonna hang off, right? So
yeah, well, I wanted to kind of clear cut it off, so I'll hang it over the edge.
Okay.
So I'm just gonna go down to about, I'll show you, lift this up a little bit so you can see. I'm just gonna go where this is really, really tight right here. At the bottom. I'll say about 2 inches from the bottom is where I'm going to start my cut at, and I'm just going to do one clean, quick cut on it, and that'll give us a much better start on this grass. So get here, get it where I want it. Like I said, about 2 inches above the bottom of the dirt, and then let's just go for it. All right, see how quick that was? Pull off the rest of that, all these matted roots down at the bottom, just simply not needed. So that's just what I cut off. That was the easy part, very quick and simple. So then now what I'm left with is this. Still a great amount of root system down below, but I've severed them, and I've gave that response to that plant to send out new roots. So after you put this in the ground and water it in really nicely, it's going to send out its own roots and quickly find its own water, which is really what you want, because we don't want to be watering as much as we can help it. It's just work. It's not very fun. So we want them to find their own quicker. So there you go. Don't be scared to use that. Now, I will say with Sawzalls, it's not really great on blades to be cutting through dirt. You'll probably go through some blades a little bit quicker than you would. But using a Sawzall is an excellent tool, not only for root pruning, but also just pruning in general. A lot of woody shrubs, using a Sawzall with a battery, you can just get around quicker and easier. It's just a really handy tool to use in the garden. So everyone should probably have one.
If they don't, though, what could like a little handsaw work? Or?
Yes, most definitely. I just use this, like I said, because it makes such quick and clean cuts, and it's much faster. So that's what I use. But yes, just a simple hand tool, just to saw it right down works just as well. So if you don't want to use these, that is totally fine. Just any type of saw with some teeth on it that's going to cut through those roots is really what you want. Just try to be clean and efficient with it. So there you go. That's a little bit on root pruning. Let me sit back down here.
Oh, right. Yeah, thanks.
It is, seriously, guys, it is, everything happens so much faster whenever you go ahead and get rid of a bottom of a root-bound plant. It does wonders for making that plant latch in just a lot quicker. So don't be scared. Do it. It's going to be helpful. So there you go. All right. Now, let's talk about the probably biggest reason why we're here, and this is going to be transplanting, say, perennial plants, bulbs, or shrubs or trees that are already in the ground to another location elsewhere in the yard. Like I mentioned earlier, the whole reason we do this is because they're not in the right spot, or they're overcrowded, or whatever the reason, you need to get them moved. So this is It's not like the most fun thing to do. It's not the easiest thing to do, but there are some plants that are a lot easier than others. So let's take, for instance, you put a hosta in a spot that you thought was getting a lot of shade that is just not. It's getting a lot more sun than you think. You're noticing those brown tips on the edges of the hosta leaves, which this happened very quickly this year, actually. I will say specific with hosta. We got hot and we got dry very quickly early in the season this year. And a lot of people saw with especially freshly planted hosta that they got put in the wrong spot and they got more sun than what they needed. So we need to get those moved. Now, timing is kind of the most crucial point whenever it comes to transplanting. When and what time of year do we want to do this? Things can be transplanted at any time of the year. Just know that. As long as the ground's not frozen, obviously, you're not going to put a shovel into the frozen ground. But for the most part, any time of year, a plant can be transplanted. Now, the best time of year is going to dictate really when you personally should do it. Most plants, especially plants that go dormant over the wintertime, so this is mainly going to be perennials, and also like woody shrubs that will drop their leaves over the wintertime. These plants specifically want to be transplanted more or less whenever they are dormant, okay? So as much as you can help it, I know it's annoying to look at those hostas that are just frying in the sun in the dead of the summer and saying, I've got to get those things moved. Well, because it's just bugging you and they're looking bad. I get it. And you kind of want to help the plant and get them out of that sun and get them in a shadier spot at that point. Like I said, you can do this, but that's going to be harder work on you. After you transplant a plant, you've got to make sure it has sufficient water, and you have to keep on it or it's going to die quickly. So that's why I say if you can wait on that plant and let it kind of get through the struggle of the summer and let it go into dormancy, and then once its leaves turn mushy and it's just done for the season and it's going into its dormancy, this is the time whenever we want to lift those plants and go ahead and move them. Now, I mentioned hosta because it's a pretty easy one to move. Hostas, as they age, if you've grown hostas, you know one hosta in the center can go from 1 to, 3, and then 5, and then 7, and then 20. You've got a whole patch of hostas, at some point. So, being able to move them and transplant them and use them in other areas of the yard is not only a good cost-effective way to get new plants, but it also just helps the health of the whole patch of hosta to kind of get rid of it. So if you want to play around with this and try it yourself, hosta is a very easy plant to move. Now, how do we actually move the plant? This is simply just work. It's hard work. It's getting a shovel out and going to town. Now, the first thing before you ever start digging and trying to lift something out of the ground, I really want you to go ahead and have your other hole where you were going to transplant this plant to. I want you to already have that dug and ready to go. You've already got a hole there. You know that once you move or once you get that hosta out or whatever plant it is, you need to move it and get it to its spot quickly and then get it watered as quick as you can. We want this to be a very quick process. We don't want the roots exposed to air for all that long if we can help it, okay? So once you pull them out of the ground, make sure they're moist. The roots are moist whenever they're going in, and then move them to that hole quickly, okay? And then let's talk about how you actually dig them. So with a hosta or a number of perennials, you don't really have to go too far from the plant to get a good amount of roots. Most of the roots of perennials are fairly shallow. Not all of them, but a lot of them are. And you don't have to get, so say the hosta's, dead center right here, and you want to put your shovel, where do you want to dig them? Your shovel with a hosta or a daylily or a little perennial like that does not have to be too far away from that main plant. You can go fairly close to it. And just like I did with these container plants, you're going to sever some roots. It's part of it. Yeah, it's not that, it's not that big of a deal to sever some of the roots. Like I said, they're going to send that response to grow new ones. So we kind of want to get a little bit of that root cut if we can. So putting your shovel down pretty close, like I said, about this far. I'm only 4 inches or so away from the base of the plant. Maybe 3 to 4 inches is really all you need. Make a straight down cut, if you will, with your shovel. Try to get nice and straight if you can, and do that literally all the way around the plant. And you're going to just make it straight down, clean cuts all the way in, and then on your last shovel, push into the ground, if you will. Your last time you kick it with your foot, you want to gently kind of knock it up, and you're going to pop that plant just out of the ground just a little bit. You're going to pop it up, like I said, to where you can feel that it's loose, and then you can put the shovel down and then go in there and physically grab up underneath the plant with your hands and get the root ball in your hands along with the dirt that's with it, and carry that over to your new hole and quickly set it into the ground. And that's how you're going to transplant a small little plant like that. Okay. Now, once you do get it moved, like I said, you're holding that root ball nice and gentle, and then you take it over to that hole, set it in the ground. Make sure we want to mimic what that plant was just getting. So that plant was in the ground, the earth has kind of settled around it, and it is nice and tight and not like wiggling around in that hole. Okay, so that's what you want to achieve in the new hole as well. So put that in the ground and make sure that the soil you use, hopefully you've got the soil out of the hole, and maybe you've amended with, say, a soil conditioner beforehand, and you have that already ready, mixed up and ready to go. Put that back in the hole, and you really, really, guys, this is crucial as well. You press firmly, very firmly actually, with the soil. You really want all that dirt that you took out to get back in that hole if you can. The tighter you can kind of press that in around the root zone is going to be, well, the key with that is that we want soil contact on the roots at all times, okay? So we don't want any separation there. After you plant a plant, you notice that dirt will settle a little bit and it'll loosen up on you. So packing it in there nice and tight is a really crucial step that I want you to do. And then after that, obviously, you're going to immediately water the root zone, okay? Not as crucial, say, in like the cold months over the winter times, I have to do it like right at that moment or anything. But anytime you replant or transplant anything, you have to have a water source close, and you've got to make sure you get it back moist, okay? In the dead of the summer, if you are one of those that are trying to move that poor looking hosta in the summertime, and you're doing it in the summertime heat and drought, it is crucial to immediately water that plant. And then, like I said, so whenever it comes to watering on a new planting, first off, don't ever water leaves. We covered that a lot. That's not ever really needed. What we do need is water specifically right around that root zone of the plants, right where you just did it. So you get your hose out and you put it right on top of the root zone. You let it come out of your hose and stay, more or less right around that spot that you just did. So if you water it and you see that your water is on top of the root zone and then starting to escape away, like out to here, that water out there is doing nothing for your plant. So that is not good practice to use that. You're just wasting water at that point. So put your hose on top of the root zone, let it fill on top of that rooting area, and then take the hose off of it. Just take it off and then watch it drain straight down to that root zone. After that happens, you're going to fill it up again. You're going to watch it get on top. You're going to get it to the edge where you want it, and then take that hose back off of it again and watch that water drain down to the area that you need it. That is the most crucial. I think watering is a really hard topic to cover, and how to do it and when to do it. That's the most crucial. Is the most crucial by far, in no matter what you're ever planting, is the very first initial watering. If you do that properly, then you will have a plant that will latch in a lot quicker than you would if you don't do it right at first. You can have, if you plant a plant and you start to see it decline quickly, then it's a water issue. A plant without water will die very, very quickly. Most other plants that are, say, overwatered, or they've got some sort of fungus or pathogen or pest or whatever, it takes a while actually for that plant to die. It's not a very quick process. A plant with no water, especially a transplanted plant without sufficient water, will start to tank quickly. So make sure that the crucial part is to get that plant well watered. And you can achieve this also using mulch. Say after you're going to plant or transplant whatever, putting a layer of mulch on top of that will help you out too, because you can water the top of that mulch, and once the water gets to the edge of that mulch line, that's whenever to take it off, and then that mulch is going to help that water go in slowly, and you're going to see this nice slow drip down to the root zone where you want it. So there you go. That's going to be on some smaller type of plants that you want to transplant. Now, on the other hand, some things like, let's say, woody shrubs or even evergreen shrubs, these plants are obviously much bigger. Okay, so what generally happens with plants is that your canopy is up top, and however wide your canopy is typically going to be mimicked down below with their root zone. So if a big old tree has a 30-foot wide canopy, the roots will go down the trunk, and then the roots will go out to a 30 feet wide area. It's what we call the drip line of the plant. So when it rains, the outermost part of the plant, which is the drip line, will send the water down, and it will fall all the way around that plant at the same drip line, and that's where typically the end of the roots are going to be. Okay, not always the case. It's not always like perfect or anything, but that's generally how it's mimicked in nature. So the reason I say that is because that's where we want to start with our shovel for the most part. When it comes to moving, say, shrubs or trees, we want to get around that drip line and even a little bit extended from it. So do know, obviously, the larger the plant, probably the more extensive the root system. So sometimes digging large shrubs or trying to move larger, say, hollies or something like that can be almost more of a chore and almost impossible a lot of times when it comes to, say, a big meaty holly or something like that. Like sometimes it's just better to cut your losses and get rid of it and replant something totally new than it would be to try to transplant that plant to a different area. So sometimes you just got to cut your losses if it's a plant that's got too extensive of a root system. It's too hard to dig. It takes major equipment to get stuff like that removed. So if you're a simple homeowner just trying to move some stuff and it's very, very large, just know that's sometimes can be a losing battle. What you don't want to do is get halfway into a plant, cutting its roots and chopping it up and exposing it to air, and then realizing, I can't do this. I mean, it's just too much work. It's too heavy. You know, landscaping is one of the hardest professions there is, and things are heavy. Things are muddy, dirty. It's a whole chore. So just make sure you know what you're in for before you start. But there's a number of shrubs that certainly can be moved whenever they're, in that right size range. So once again, with deciduous plants, we are going to wait until dormancy if we can help it. So let them drop their leaves totally. With most deciduous plants, we do most of our cutting on them and pruning over the dormant period as well. So before you decide to transplant a deciduous shrub, go ahead and do your pruning first. So if you have a, say, limelight hydrangea that you have to prune every year, because you typically do, this is going to help you out along the way. Instead of having to try to transplant this big old long leggy, stemmy plant that's just kind of going to be all in your way, go ahead and do your top pruning first. So let's get that cleaned up. How we typically do, we're going to keep main stems, nice main canes on it that are thick in nature. We're going to create a vase shape with our stems, and we're going to open up the center as much as we can to make sure to allow for airflow. It's a general rule, but for the most part, that goes with most deciduous plants. So let's do that first before we ever decide to do any transplanting. So then after that, it's going to be no different than what I talked about with the hostas. You're going to simply, start, but you want to start where the drip line was of the plant. So this may be, from the main stem or whatever. You may go out, say, 2 feet from where the main part of the plant is, because the biggest rule of thumb on this is that we want to try to get as much of the roots as we can whenever they're in the ground. So like I said, we're going to sever some roots. That is totally okay. But we want that main, root system, that whole main root zone that we really want to get as much of that as we can. So it's going to be a little bit more involved than with a hosta. If you need help, sometimes having an extra pair of hands is so nice whenever you're transplanting. It just makes things happen quicker. It's just very, very helpful to have a buddy or your spouse or whatever come out and help you do this. It makes the process go a lot easier. So, like I said, no different than the hosta. Same way, pop your shovel in the ground and work yourself all the way around it. Get to where you can get all the way around, and then sometimes using this old friend here, the old Sawzall, after you've got it chopped enough to where that plant starts to wiggle a little bit, you might have to get that shovel up underneath and kind of slide it in, underneath and try to pop it up. It's a process, y'all, and some plants are really, really a lot tougher than you think they are. They don't, you don't have to be super gentle about this or anything. You can really get in there and, you're going to have to use some elbow grease to get these things out of here sometimes. They're a little bit tough, especially if they've been in the ground for a number of years. So, don't be too scared on jerking on it too much or whatever. You're going to have to do some of that. And then, like I said, taking that shovel and popping it out of the ground as much as you can, grabbing it either by the stems, because you're going to have a good amount of roots. You're not going to have to worry too much about holding it from the bottom or anything. The dirt is going to stick onto those roots pretty well, so you don't have to worry about that necessarily so much. So grab it by the sticks, try to work it out of the ground as much as you can. And like I said, using a sawzall sometimes to kind of clean up some of those other roots. You know how it is. Sometimes with the roots, they want to hang on and they want to, stick into the earth. They don't really necessarily want to be removed. So you're going to be tugging on that, and you might see there's some roots still left in there trying to hold on for their life. Well, taking the old sawzall out and getting down in there and just severing those ties at the end of it, and then pop it out, lifting it up. And like I said, it's good practice to kind of moisten the roots. Take your hose and just kind of make sure the roots are moist, because whenever you expose it to air, that's whenever it dries out the quickest. So try to make sure the roots are moist, and then take that right over to your next hole and have the hole already dug, like I'd mentioned, and stick it down in there, and make sure you press firmly once again and water. You don't transplant a plant any different really based on what plant it is. We're all going to have the same method. So big plant or small plant, treat them the same way. It's just the amount of material you're going to use is going to be a little bit different. So, yeah, there you go. It's a lot like work. I will tell you that. It's like I mentioned earlier, landscaping is very, very hard to do. If you feel like you have a lot of stuff to get done and you need it done quickly and you need it done, you got a lot to do and it's a little daunting for you, hire a landscaping company to come out and do it. They've done it before. They know what they're doing. And they can, maybe get that done quicker for you. But it can certainly be done by most people. It just takes the right tools, and it takes some hard work and just some get at it. So
Speaking of the right tools, Austin.
Yep.
We got a question here. Serrated bread knife work to cut the root systems? Or would you say you need something a little bit more substantial?
I'd go a little bit more stout than that, I think. I think you'll quickly see if you use a bread knife like that how hard that's going to be to actually get through a root system, especially if you were using some of these grasses I was talking about. They're very dense. So, I think that it would eventually certainly work, but I think it's going to be a tough task to use a bread knife on it. More of a steak knife, I think, with some more, some deeper serrations, I think would be better practice than a bread knife.
And another useful tool that might be employed is a steel digging bar. If you have one of those, you can slide it up under the root ball of the plant and kind of use it as a lever. Most
definitely. That's a very good point. I grew up just calling it a tamp bar. We did a lot of fencing growing up, and you tamp, gravel down into a fence post hole. And what he's talking about is a bar that is literally just straight metal. It is very, very heavy. They're difficult to handle if you're not, if it's they're like I said, they're just a very heavy bar, but if you can use them, they're an excellent landscape tool as well, especially for those bigger chunkier shrubs to try to get out of the ground. Like he said, once you get it kind of cut and you got it worked around the whole plant, putting that tamp bar down into the ground and then popping it with that, it's a very useful tool. Like I said, it's heavy, but it's also heavy duty, and it makes jobs a lot easier to use. That's a very good tool to use as well. Good, thank you for that, Tyler.
Sure. And also, while I'm popping my face up here, Tanya, who asked the question about using a serrated bread knife, there are some one-handed recip saws or sawzalls that you can get that just, you pop a battery in the end and it's got the same kind of long blade, and you can use that for chopping too. If some of the plants, the containerized plants that you're planting are relatively small, like the 1 gallon one that Austin was using. So there's that.
Yep. And with little plants like that, like I said, most of the time you can just use your hands, and you can really just use your hands and peel it back and peel it off. So any way you can do it, though, is a good way to do it. So there you go. We did some talking about transplant. Now, I guess while
if you have any questions,
oh yes,
ask them now.
Please ask me questions.
We're ready for your questions.
Totally ready. I knew this probably wasn't going to be all that long of a topic. I think it's a really good topic. We get this question a lot, and just to recap real quick, the timing is really what we want to focus on, and that's when to do it, and that's for the most part during dormancy. So obviously, even evergreens keep their leaves through the winter times. They certainly do, but they're still dormant. They're not actively growing. So moving evergreens over the winter time is the way to do it as well, or at least the late fall. Just something to where you can tell it's not those two really harsh seasons. So like the deadest part of the summer, not a good practice to be trying to move things in the deadest part of the summer. It is just really hard on you. It's stressful, way more stressful on the plant. It's just not worth it. So waiting until dormancy is much better on that. And then dead of the wintertime, say we do have a frozen ground. That's just obvious. We're not going to be trying to move things at that point of the season. It's too hard on you. It's not worth it. So avoid those two extremes, and you can be fine. Now, spring transplanting is also another fine practice. We're generally here, at least in Middle Tennessee, we're generally pretty wet in the springtime. We get plenty of adequate rains. This year was a little bit different. We got dry pretty quick, but for the most part, springtime is going to be another time to transplant plants. It's a fine time to do it. Go ahead and get it done, get it in the ground, water it sufficiently, and then keep an eye on it through the summer months. You know, a newly transplanted plant is probably going to need some water in the summertime from you. I say probably, it's going to. So just get ready for that. If you do it in the spring, you will have to watch it in the summertime. Now, on the flip side of that, if you plant a plant in the fall and let it get through the whole winter being watered and establishing a root system, sometimes there's a number of plants that you may never have to water again. You know, the spring's going to have plenty of rains to keep it going. The summer's obviously going to be dry, but it might have enough stored energy. It might have enough root system to be able to not have to be watered, which is great. That's kind of why I do any of my planting or transplanting in the fall, because I like that process. Let the wintertime water it in for me. And then I don't have to do near as much the following year. Now, I will say, keep an eye on it in periods of drought. You need to make sure you're vigilant if something is going on. If a plant's starting to wilt or yellow from the interior and then drop, those are clear signs of an underwatered plant. So keep an eye on it. But doing it in the fall is going to help you out greatly through the next season. So there you go. And let's talk real quick about what's up, Tyler. You're up there.
Well, I was just going to chime in that I learned a very hard lesson this year. It wasn't a very expensive lesson, thankfully, because some of the plants that I used were essentially throwaways that I was trying to rescue here at the nursery. But, you know, with the heat and the dryness that we had this year, it was difficult to keep things alive. And, you know, I think the biggest thing that hit me was maybe the biggest lesson that I had to learn was the frequency of watering, which should be more deeply, and maybe you could skip a day or two rather than every single day
a little
just
bit
dousing it. Because, you know, first of all, I think the roots do need to breathe. I think you have to consider Mother Nature too, and the fact that we might get, you know, a quarter inch or an inch of rain, and that would be sufficient for at least one watering period. But like when it's really extremely hot like that, like there's no surface moisture at all. And there's no mature roots developed to go down and get that water yet. So we do have a question. We have two questions actually right now. First one is, any advice on moving Baptisia, or is it Baptisia? Baptisia. Well, first of all, I did that in my own garden, and it was really alarming to me how deep the roots go on that plant. So first of all, be sure and determined of the location you're going to move it to, because when it re-roots again, it's going to be just as much of a pain to get out. Because I literally, as I was digging it up, there are just like these roots that are just in. It feels like it's like attached by cables.
Yeah. I know. That's what I was kind of saying earlier with the Sawzall. That can be very helpful with some of those roots that still want to latch in there, you know?
Yes.
And, ma'am, to answer your question, Baptisia is no different than any other plant we had talked about. Like Tyler said, though, it does have an extensive root system, but Baptisia is really, really well known as being an extremely hardy perennial, okay? Has minimal pest issues, minimal pathogens that get on them. It's a very easy perennial to grow. It happens to be my favorite perennial to grow of any of the perennials. I absolutely love Baptisia. It is a beautiful, stunning plant in all sorts of colors nowadays. Yellow is my personal favorite. I've got 3 of them in a ring back behind a hydrangea tree. Makes a really nice scene. But yeah, just go out a little bit further than what you would think because of that extensive root system, and do the same thing we had talked about. Go all the way around it with your shovel and pop it up with as much as you can, and hold that from the bottom. You know, probably don't hold that from the stems. They don't really have woody stems per se. They're more herbaceous, and you can kind of break those if you're not careful. So hold that up underneath the root zone and then get it to where you want it to go. And it should latch in just fine. Like I said, Baptisia is an easy plant to grow. One of the best. I think it should be used in every perennial garden or any garden for in general. I really, really do. Really great plant. So
It's also beneficial for the soil of wherever you have it planted in.
it is. It's a leguminous crop, I guess. It's a nitrogen
Yes.
fixating plant. And I'm pretty sure, what do they call it? It's the blue one. I want to say Native Americans use the blue from they made it makes like an indigo color, and I think they use that for like dyeing stuff, like clothing and whatnot. So yeah,
Common name is false indigo.
false indigo, correct? Yeah. So there you have it, Baptisia. But like I said, no different. Do it the same way, just like you would any plant. The only difference is, like I mentioned, try not to grab those stems. We don't want to break those or anything. So hold it from the bottom after you pull it up.
All right, next question. Other than plants that are just too big, are there plants that just don't lend themselves to transplanting?
That is an excellent question, and I meant to talk about that. And yes, there are. There's a number of plants that people ask for out here at the nursery that we as nurserymen know don't dig very well. And that's the term we use. We call digging them. And there's a couple of trees. So there's one... There's a couple of different trees, actually, that people a lot of times ask for because they are natives around here, but we're just not hardly in the trade because they are fairly hard to transplant. And that's going to be, say, oxydendron. And that is a common name is sourwood. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but it grows out in the woods. It's a beautiful tree. It flowers really pretty. It's got good fall color. But it is well known in the plant world that they don't dig all that easily. So it's not that it can't be done. They can certainly be done, but they're a little bit trickier. Sassafras is another plant that I have heard does not transplant all that well. So I have actually dug a sassafras for my friend Joy here, who's in our perennial department. She's excellent with our natives, and I had a number of sassafras on my property, so I told her I'll dig you a few up, see how it goes. And we didn't get 100%, results, and they weren't perfect by any means, but she got a couple to latch in and living in a pot, and they live just fine. So it can be done. The key is getting enough of that root as you can. And there's a number of plants that send down a somewhat of a long taproot. You can sever a taproot at the kind of bottom of it, but you really want to try to avoid severing that up too high because you will see they don't do well after you do that. So really getting deep with the long taprooting trees is going to be better off at helping you. Another plant that for some reason sometimes doesn't transplant all that well is going to be juniper. Don't really know why, because junipers are extremely hardy plants, but for some reason they don't like to be moved all that much if you can help it. So those are some ones that I know just off the top of my head that are in the trade that aren't the easiest to move. But in theory, if you get enough roots and you get them to that spot and they have the right amount of moisture, most things can take and be just fine. So that's a very good question, though. All right.
Okay. Any other questions? We're here for a couple more minutes, unless Austin has anything else to add.
Real quick, let's just talk about your bulbs, transplanting those and lifting those. You have to. Some bulbs are tried and true. You never have to move them once they're in or whatever, and they'll come back year to year. But there's a number of bulbs that aren't like that. So let's just talk about dahlias, for instance. Dahlia is one of my favorite summertime bloomers. They're blooming around town right now. Absolutely beautiful plants. Sometimes a dahlia can perennialize here. Okay, you can get lucky, but a lot of times they don't. So we just decide to lift them. Do this the same way, guys. Go out as far as from the main chunk of the plant. You want to go out, maybe even a foot for your dahlias and start digging those up and get those lifted. You're going to knock off a good amount of the dirt, but you don't have to go crazy. They can be, I don't want any moisture really on bulbs over the wintertime. So that's why we generally are going to, what they did in the old days is you would take your bulbs or your tubers or whatever and you put them in a root cellar. So that's going to be like below your house, 50 degrees roughly. And that's where they're going to spend their winter time being dormant. We want to try to mimic that as much as we can. I know a lot of people don't have root cellars anymore. So mimic it as much as we can. So lift up those tubers or the bulbs, whatever you're doing, knock off some of the dirt and put them in a paper bag and seal them up pretty good. It ain't got to be airtight or anything, but seal them up somewhat good. And then put them either in your garage, in a shed over the wintertime, or like under a sink. A lot of times stays a little bit cooler. We just don't want it too warm to where they're going to want to break dormancy inside your house. So that's a common issue in the spring once weather starts to warm up and they're still in your house or whatever. If they're in a 72-degree environment and they're starting to see sunlight, you might see some of those things start to sprout inside your home. We want to try to avoid that. So transplanting bulbs and tubers are no different. Just like I said, you don't want to disturb the main, especially dahlias. Dahlias are they can be finicky, like they can drop off somewhat easy. Their tubers are held together by like not very sturdy modified roots, if you will, and so if you're not careful whenever you're digging those, or you might knock off a few of those, which is kind of not what you want. So just be careful with those and be mindful that dahlias specifically can break off if you're not careful. So, but once again, no different on how to transplant or how to actually dig it up. So thanks guys for watching. We do really enjoy doing this for you, and I really hope that it's helpful, and that your transplanting is not going to be all that hard. Like I said, it's going to be hard, it's going to be work, but it is well worth it once you get something moved and get it established in its new home, and it's going to be much happier there. So once again, thanks for watching, and I hope y'all have a great day.